My name is Sergius Longinus of the Governor's Prison Sentry. I've been a loyal Roman soldier since I was old enough to even fight. But what I felt yesterday, what I feel that my loyalty to Rome is faltering. It was during my time in Syria that I first heard of this Messiah, as his fellow Judeans called him. I was stationed to guard the Syrian satrap, the governor who rules over the area. It wasn't really that big of an area in Syria, just a tiny little bit. Probably never even heard of it. I arrived there well prepared to uphold my duties of keeping the eastern colonies secure and under imperial reign. It was the satrap's advisor I overheard that night. He was talking of a trip he took long ago to a land called Judea. He spoke of a small boy, a boy that would one day be king. I stood at the ready, one hand on my sword and the other on my spear, listening for any signs of an uprising, but I meant to charge in to interrogate the man, but something was holding me back. I can't explain it. It was the oddest thing. I continued listening. The man talked of the boy, said he was a savior sent by his God. A savior that would allow all languages to sound alike. Never again heard the man speak of the boy, and to my relief there was no uprising. Several years later that I was again relocated, and in fact this time I was stationed in Judea itself. I remembered back on the story the old man was telling of the boy, this Messiah. He called the boy a strange word, a word that until recently I had completely forgotten. Called the boy Christ. Christ. I've heard that word so often recently. Much prefer it to Messiah. It sounds more Roman. I was assigned to work in the prison here, particularly with executions. Gruesome. 2 nights ago, a prisoner was brought in. A man beaten senseless, beaten half to death. I wasn't one of the men who brought him in, thank God, but one of my friends was. He told me the oddest story about his ear. I stood in the back as I watched the man's trial. It was no trial, it was a mockery. Those fools in their ridiculous robes. They don't use an ounce of intelligence. Honestly, if I was Governor Pilate himself, I would have had those fools hanged for ignorance. Then again, I'm no better. Not anymore. They dragged the poor man from building to building until he must have walked around the whole of Jerusalem twice. They took him to the temple and then to that doddering hedonist Agrippa, and finally to Governor Pontius himself. Oh, how I wish I could have heard what they were talking about. Instead, I was outside, listening to the crowds, hearing them speak of the man they called their Christ, that he would free them from Roman rule. At first I took this to mean that he wished to usurp the throne of Caesar. And in my heart, I secretly hoped for the man's death. I was that loyal to Rome. Then again, even that may be about to change. They dragged the man out, pronounced him to be executed. We set about the task. Within hours, they had him marching toward a small mound nearby, some called Golgotha. It was Calvary. And there, before us all, we set up his cross, there beneath the sky. For 9 long hours we watched the man die. I stood attentive, my eyes always at the ready, hand on my spear, hand on my sword. Near the end of the man's execution, the fellow guards started casting lots on the man's clothing. Obviously I didn't join in. What would I do with a bunch of blood-stained clothing from an executed prisoner? It was in the 9th hour that the sky began to turn dark. It was as if a storm was rolling in, but the rain was being held back. There was wind and thunder and lightning and darkness all around us. Judean's priest, they ordered us, they had the audacity to order us to make sure that the prisoners were dead by nightfall. And so we did what we were trained to do. We broke the legs of the 2 men behind the Christ man. They screamed, but they would be dead within the hour. But we weren't sure about the Christ man. He wasn't screaming, wasn't flailing, wasn't begging for mercy as the others were. His chest wasn't even rising. Captain Julianus told me to make sure that the man was dead, so I took my spear, aimed it high, and shoved it right into the man's side. Blood and water poured out everywhere, right into the oncoming wind. Wind smeared it all into my eyes. And then everything changed. I felt my eyes grow sharper, keener, more powerful than they had ever been. But it was more than that. It was as if I could see the entire world itself. It was as if for the tiny fraction of a minute, I could see the entire world and all of its history, all leading up to this very moment. The blood of this man smeared over my eyes, allowed me to see beyond what anyone else could see. It was as if my entire life was a dream, and I was finally waking up to see everything as it really was. Then I was asleep again. I was on my knees, crying to be awake, begging to know who I had seen in that brief moment of awakening. Then as I looked up at the dead Christ man, I realized it was him. He was the one that I had seen. This man, I cried out to my fellow Roman soldiers, this man! Truly, he was the Son of God! And it was that moment I realized that the Pantheon of Rome was nothing compared to this man. The man that They say the dead are walking among us right now. That men have arisen from their graves in defiance of this God's death. And I killed the Christ man. I killed God. How can I ever be redeemed for that?